Hi, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to part 2 of the design process. I hope you've learned a lot from part 1, where I covered mood boards, inspiration, researching from a design brief and everything like that. I will put the link in the description box so that you could be able to watch it if you haven't watched it. I think it's very helpful to watch it first before you watch this one, so please make sure that you do. Otherwise, let's start with part 2. So in part 2, we are going to discuss a lot about patterns, and we're going to discuss a lot about garment construction, especially sampling and doing samples like that. So I'm going to do a lot of voiceover, just like I did for part 1, and I'm going to explain the process with images, so it's just not me talking to you. It's better if you actually see what it is. I'm going to cover 2 processes of pattern drafting. There is one called freehand cutting, which is actually not pattern drafting, and pattern drafting. The difference between freehand cutting and pattern drafting is that with freehand, you basically, or what most tailors do, because that's what the method most African tailors are used to, and that's how they learn, is that they cut the outfit without a pattern. So what I usually do, because I know how to do both methods, is that I draft, because I learned my fashion design skill with pattern drafting, so I still draft the freehand pattern on a paper before I transfer it onto the fabric. I don't like cutting directly on the fabric. It is a very rare thing that I would do that. It has to be something very, very simple. But because I have the pattern drafting technique, I always put it also in my freehand. Freehand is very helpful because it's very fast. Pattern drafting tends to be more complicated, as you will see with the samples I'll show you. There are freehand instructions that you usually use, which most tailors have memorized. It's how they are able to just cut the fabric. So I will give you a glimpse of what those look like so that you can see the simplicity and you'll be able to compare them. I'll probably repeat some of this information on the voiceover, so please watch to the end. Welcome again. The pattern drafting book relies on the size chart to get its measurements, and the measurements are very many and very detailed. The basic block patterns are made from the metric size chart, which is available in the metric pattern drafting book that we used in college. And from there, after you have the basic block, is when you use that block to alter it to your client's measurements. After that, then you proceed to alter the pattern again into the desired design. From the instructions, you can see why it's a very long and tedious process. I've decided to show you an example of what pattern drafting can look like. This is specifically my corset pattern. A corset is very complex and very technical, so you can't cut it with freehand, and I wanted to show you basically how the corset pattern pieces would look like. There are very many because of the nature of the corset. So they are well labeled and numbered and put in order. And you'll probably see how the corset looks like in the sample section of this video. Freehand cutting measurements are fewer and way more simplified. So these are the freehand pattern cutting instructions. They're pretty simple and straightforward, very repetitive, so it's easy to memorize them. And usually a tailor will draw the instructions directly onto the fabric and do whatever alterations they need to do and then stitch the garment. I still prefer to do this on paper first and then alter it on paper and then cut the fabric because it helps with less mistakes. But I would definitely recommend it for someone who's doing sewing as a hobby. This would be probably more ideal than getting into pattern drafting. Making a sample for a corset is a longer process because of the function of a corset. So I definitely have to start with a sample on a cheaper fabric and then make it in the final fabric and do necessary adjustments before I put the bones in. A good example of why pattern drafting is very necessary for technical clothes. For this freehand pattern, I decided to use newspaper because generally people cut freehand on fabric, and I didn't want to use regular paper that we use for patterns. So I started with drafting the pattern and then cut the pattern on cheap fabric because of the design of the sleeve I was trying to do. The dress itself is a simple design, but I wanted to have a unique sleeve. So I made a couple of prototypes, had to adjust a couple of times and add features to create the look I had wanted with the pattern, and basically had to hand sew some parts just to create the look I wanted, and then this is the final result. This is a specific step sometimes I do take when I'm making outfits, especially when I'm not very sure if my idea will work out. So I will do a bit of back and forth when I'm stitching. So example, this wrap skirt, I was not sure whether or not I should add a frill, but I tried it on the mannequin and I saw I needed a frill, and then I go back to the machine and I add it, and I usually have extra fabric for that. So this is just another step I wanted to show, which is part of the garment construction process, especially when you're making a prototype before you decide on the very final design. Not everybody does this step, but this is like a very crucial step, especially when you're doing ready to wear clothes, because you have to make sure it's available for all the other sizes. The beauty of a wrap skirt is that generally it fits more than one size. So thank you so much for making it to the end. I'm sure you've learned a lot, and I'm sure you're seeing how this design process can be very, very complicated. So next week I will be covering production, more about production. So watch out for that, and there's a special surprise for all of you who are planning to shop for Black Friday, especially if you're planning to shop for clothes. I'm going to cover some of that next week, just in time. And also there is one more thing I had not covered, which was draping. Draping is also another method used for pattern making. Draping is actually the oldest form of pattern making. Paper patterns actually came around the 1890s. So you will find that draping is very popular in the West because that's probably how they learned to make their clothes. What it involves is taking a piece of fabric. It's usually a very cheap piece of fabric that you put on top of somebody, and then you pin it in specific areas to create the shape of the garment you want. I'm sure you've seen it a lot if you watch things like Project Runway or any other fashion competition. Sure, you'll probably see designers using a lot of draping. And then from the draping, what has happened now is people transfer the sample fabric once it fits well with the client. Some people even sew it into a full garment. They probably undo it or create patterns from paper, and then now cut the real fabric. And the reason why it's good to use paper patterns on the real fabric that you will make the outfit from is because sometimes there are prints you want to place in certain places, and it helps when you have a pattern. And because you know how it looked like on the client, it helps you know how it will, you can be able to envision it. I personally am not very good at draping, that's why there's no footage of it, and I learned with pattern drafting. I've tried draping, I did a workshop on draping, but it's when you're used to pattern drafting and visualizing your clothes in 2D, it's very difficult to visualize it in 3D. But there are people who learn from draping, and it's very hard for them to understand the 2D patterns. So none of them is better than the other, it's just what is best for you. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope to see you next week. Bye.